Hi, Ash.
Hey, Kirsty.
So when we commissioned this piece from you, you told me a little story that one of the monitoring shops that you mentioned in your piece, your mum and dad met at one of them.
Yeah, so clearly they had their eye on something other than police violence. I don't know if it undermines their activism, but yeah, they met doing new monitoring project, which is one of the few monitoring projects which still exists to this day.
Well, there's a great documentary, the ACT UP documentary about AIDS activism in New York in the 80s. And one of the organisers there said he wanted people hooking up as part of just what the group did. Because he's like, that's how you get people to come to meetings. They're really boring otherwise. I mean, maybe your mum and dad were onto it way earlier.
Maybe, you're saying that as a kind of transitional demand where it's like, okay, we haven't won this fight, but you can go on a couple of dates with this cutie if you show up to this long 3-hour meeting.
Exactly. So do you feel like when people talk about working class in the UK, that part of your own family history and indeed your own history gets erased when people talk about it just in terms of whiteness?
Completely. Not just in terms of race, but also gender. So particularly in critical race circles or in histories or in British historical circles, we talk about the fact that waves of migration occurred post-World War II to fill certain labour shortages. And when we imagine those labour shortages, we gender that work as predominantly male. Mm-hmm. So we think about things like bus conductors, or we think about factory work. What we don't talk about is the situation that my grandmother found herself in. She was 17. She came to this country in 1954, I think it was. She moved just onto North Road near Caledonian Road. Mm-hmm. And she was working as a care worker, which was another labour shortage. So this kind of newly created NHS and care system needed predominantly, black and brown, predominantly female workers to come and staff it. So one of the things I'm trying to get at in this article is that we suffer from a selective cultural memory in which we racialize the working class as white, and when we don't, it's predominantly male.
Do you think that that's done purposefully? So when you talk about Thatcher and you talk about Blair, do you feel like that was, set out as an agenda, or do you think it was the result of, implicit biases within policymaking?
The breakup of the working class into discrete ethnic and cultural communities was a concerted project. It didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen by accident. You read interviews with not just UK Home Secretaries, but also, say, Reagan's Secretary of State. These projects of funding, which also went hand in hand with the over-policing of certain communities, was intended to break up Black socialist radicalism on both sides of the Atlantic. So you think about what happened at the end of the Black Power movement. You had the most senior organizing figures incarcerated or indeed murdered by the state. And then others were kind of ossified in, the bureaucracy or in the state apparatus itself. And I think you find the same over here. So you had very prominent members repeatedly harassed by the police or attacked violently by police in terms of Black anti-racist organising from the 1970s onwards. And then those that didn't were kind of softened by just enough money to achieve projects of representation, but that significantly moderated the message of redistribution.
Do you think it was also, as well as being at the policy level, do you think there's a cultural level where, I don't know, film, TV, British culture overemphasised and overrepresented the white working class? So I'm thinking, your Only Fools and Horses and your Steptoe and Sons, and maybe books like Don't Look Back in Anger, mm-hmm. Versus books like Lonely Londoners by Sam Selvin. I feel like one part of that canon gets overrepresented than the other. Do you agree?
Yes, certainly. I think The Lonely Londoners by Sam Selvin is a great example of this.
If listeners haven't read it, it's just one of the most beautiful books.
It's perfect. And I think it's one of the best accounts of living poor in London that I've ever read. And it's just as relevant today as it was when it was published. I'm not thinking so much about the kitchen sink tradition of UK fiction and drama. I love that kind of stuff myself, because it's very dangerous to start saying, well, just because the white working class is a sociological construct, it means that white working class households, individuals and neighbourhoods don't exist. They very much do, and that representation is important. But you look at the cultural moment of the early 2000s, and do you remember the BBC had the White season?
No.
So it was a series of films and programs, mostly one-offs, which are about white people, white working class people. I remember watching one which I thought was a load of rubbish, to be honest, where a white girl converts to Islam and everyone loses their mind. So these projects are very well funded and very politically effective when you consider at what point in British political history is this coming out. So the BBC's White season is kind of at the Blair Project zenith in terms of, increasing public-private finance initiatives, in terms of widening inequalities, in terms of getting a never-ending war on terror started both domestically and abroad. So it's not just about saying like, oh, Ken Loach, can you not? Because, love my man Ken. But looking at how, again, coming back to policy and funding, how and when these things come about.
I wonder also we can talk about, as well as it being at the policy level and the cultural level, in terms of the right, so like Thatcher and Reagan over in the US and the centre with Blair, but also identity over material concerns. And when I say material concerns, I mean like, your economics, your bread and butter, what's going in and out your bank account. The left are also really keen on identity. So I feel like it's a conversation which is sort of like, I think you described it as like the register of the individual, like only talking about politics from an individual perspective rather than a structural perspective. Why do you think that has come about?
I mean, this is where we as anti-racists really have to hold our hands up and say, look, we have been just as affected by neoliberal hegemony as the centre has, or the white left, or the right has. I think there's a reason why when we talk about intersectionality, it's not in the way that Kimberly Crenshaw had intended it to be. We start looking at it as a kind of oppression Olympics where you kind of stack up these subject positions and from that you assume greater authority to speak on things. That's not what Kimberly Crenshaw intended.
So for listeners who maybe haven't read up on what intersectionality is, can you kind of explain what it is and what it was supposed to be?
For Kimberly Crenshaw, intersectionality is a way of explaining the politicized experience of Black women in America. So you're not just a woman and your political heritage isn't just the feminine mystique until now. It's saying that this there's an intellectual history which kind of goes from women who were organizing against slavery right through to the kind of 1970s womanist movement, and that there are very particular social, economic, and historical forces shaping your experience. So it's not primarily a matter of identity at all. It's looking at how power dynamics shape positions of vulnerability. So you're not just a woman, you're a Black woman, or you're a Black disabled woman, or you're a Black queer woman. That has sometimes been interpreted as something which is intensely atomizing. So intersections, you start thinking about the point of the crossroads rather than the roads and where they've come from and where they're going.
And why do you think it's become such a useful shorthand for people also on the left? Because there's a book right now, maybe not a lot of people have read it, but it's definitely taken Twitter over at the moment, called Kill All Normies by Angela Nagel. And she critiques both the left and the right for being too extreme online. And she critiques the left for taken identity to its sort of like absurd zenith, where people identify as I don't know, pieces of cutlery, I think is her great example. I mean that's a much critiqued argument, but I think what she picks up on is this trend within the left to use identity as a shorthand to talk about oppression. But where did that come from? At what point did people pick that up and not critique it as something that actually maybe isn't a helpful term?
Again, I think we have to look at the impact of neoliberalism. So why is it that intersectionality, which I do think is a very useful analytic tool, and more importantly, it's a very useful social tool. So when you're in an organizing space, and I don't know what it's like to be a trans woman of color, but I've got an understanding that a trans woman is vulnerable in very specific ways, and this is a way of opening up that conversation where they can tell me about their experience and tell me what's needed in terms of solidarity. I think that's great. But one of the most dangerous things in politics is stasis and complacency. So let's not act as though an understanding of oppression stops with Kimberly Crenshaw. In terms of why it's been so popularized and indeed vulgarized, right? What Nagel is critiquing is a very vulgar form of intersectionality, which is just as bad as the vulgar Marxism, which says that the working class is white, owns a whippet, and works in a factory. The reason behind this, and this is something which Nagel doesn't look at, which I think is a crying shame, is the impact of neoliberalism on social movements. You look at the 1960s and 70s as an incomplete revolution. Why is it that we are happy to talk about something which looks at us as, hyper-isolated, atomized individuals, but not, say, the intellectual work of Angela Davis, who was also writing about race, class, and gender. And one of her critiques of intersectionality was that you cannot simply look at race, gender, class when you're looking at the obverse of positions of power, right? So that these things only come into being when you're talking about, Black working class women, for instance. If you're talking about a white moneyed man, Angela Davis would say, well, aren't you always talking about histories of racism then? You have to look at these things in a much more bundled up and, epistemically messy way in order to come to any understanding. And also you need one which is thoroughly grounded in a materialist analysis, one that looks at what's coming in and out of your bank account, as you put it, or indeed how the bank itself was founded, in order to get anywhere at all. So one of those analyses is a lot more dangerous when it comes to the project of, overthrowing capitalism than one which kind of treats you as a isolated, piece of social debris floating around, feeling injured.
If you could conceive then of a definition of class that you'd find most useful in the UK for people to come together and begin to fight the economic inequality that we're all facing right now, what would that look like?
Right. Are you in charge of how you make your money?
No.
Then you're probably working class. For me, it comes down to, again, outing myself as maybe a vulgar Marxist here, class is a property relation. So if you're part of a renter class, right, rather than a property owning class, whether you're part of a class which has unsustainable levels of debt, if you're in a precariously employed class, so maybe you have 3 part-time jobs, 2 of which are on 0 hours, you're working class. Again, Owen Hatherley, I think, puts it very well, which is we have come to imagine class as a set of cultural distinctions, which is why you can have some ridiculous figure like Owen Smith getting in a flap that his coffee wasn't served in a mug and it was in a nice little latte thing, because it's just this completely shallow, analysis of like accoutrements and accessories. When you actually look at class in terms of money, and then you look at how class is racialized in terms of who is more likely to have less money. So you look at the racialized differential in terms of assets, right? Average household assets. It's a hugely racialized dynamic there. That's class. For me, it comes down to something really simple, which is what do you own and how do you make your P's?
Well, thank you for joining us. And then everyone can add that definition of class now to the canon.
I just read Capital, innit? Like, it just sort of end up saying to people like, oh, just read Capital, man.
Just even on Wikipedia. Cool. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.